There is a stretch of land outside Cape Town, South Africa, that the apartheid government built specifically to be forgotten. They called it the Cape Flats. Flat land, sandy soil, no natural resources, no coastline, no beauty the state considered worth preserving. Between the 1950s and the 1980s, the apartheid government moved hundreds of thousands of people onto that land. Black South Africans, colored South Africans, people who had lived in Cape Town for generations and who were reclassified and removed and deposited onto the flats and told that this was where they belonged now. Their old homes were demolished, their old communities were erased, and the land they were given in return was flat and windswept and deliberately, systematically underserved. It was onto this land, into these communities, that someone came for 22 boys. Between 1986 and 1994, 22 young boys were murdered in the Cape Flats. Most were between 8 and 15 years old. Most were strangled. Most were found near railway stations, those liminal spaces where children wait alone, where the platform empties and the next train is still 10 minutes away and the dark comes early in the Cape winter. A man was eventually convicted. He said he was innocent from the first day of his arrest to the last day of his trial, and every single day of the 25 years he spent in prison after it. And the question that has haunted South African criminology for 30 years is this: what if he was telling the truth? Before we go any further, if you are new here, this channel exists to tell the stories that history tried to erase. Stories from communities that were built to be invisible, about crimes that were investigated by a system that did not value the lives it was supposed to protect. If that matters to you, hit subscribe right now. It costs you nothing. And it means these stories keep getting told. Now, let us get into it. To understand what happened in the Cape Flats between 1986 and 1994, you have to understand what the Cape Flats was. Not geographically, politically, socially, in human terms. The apartheid government of South Africa operated on a simple and brutal principle. People could be categorized by race, and those categories could be used to determine where they lived, where they worked, where their children went to school, and what their lives were worth to the state. Under the Group Areas Act of 1950, the government had the legal authority to declare any area a whites-only zone and remove everyone else by force. Cape Town had been a mixed city for generations, colored communities, meaning people of mixed ancestry under apartheid's classification system had lived in areas like District 6 and Tramway Road and the Bo Kaap for 100 years. Their great-grandparents had built those neighborhoods. Their grandparents had been born there. They belonged there in the only way that truly matters. They had made those places theirs over generations of living and loving and burying their dead. The government bulldozed it all. District 6 was demolished between 1968 and 1982. 60,000 people were removed. The houses came down. The churches came down. The schools and the shops and the street corners where people had gathered for a century, all of it came down. And the people were relocated to the Cape Flats, 15 kilometers southeast of the city, onto land the government had selected for them precisely because it was far enough away and poor enough in quality that it would take generations to recover from. The soil was loose and sandy. The wind came off the mountain cold and relentless. In the winter, the streets flooded. In the summer, the dust moved through everything. The Cape Flats received those displaced communities on top of communities that had already been living there in poverty. The result was catastrophic overcrowding, insufficient infrastructure, inadequate schooling, chronic unemployment, and a police presence that functioned not as protection, but as an extension of the state's control apparatus. The South African police of the apartheid era did not exist to serve communities like those on the Cape Flats. They existed to surveil them, to contain them, to enforce pass laws and curfews and the 1,000 daily humiliations of a system built on the premise that certain people were not fully human and that their safety was therefore not the state's primary concern. This is the world into which 22 boys were born. They had names. They had mothers who called them in for dinner, and fathers who taught them things, and teachers who knew their handwriting, and friends who saved them seats on the school bus. They were real people, living real lives in a community that had been stripped of its geography and its history, but not of its humanity. That, the apartheid state, could remove from the map, but not from the people themselves. The first murder that investigators would eventually link to the station strangler case is believed to have occurred in 1986. A young boy found strangled in the Cape Flats, near a station. The investigation went nowhere quickly. In a community that the state had already written off, in a time when the police were more focused on the political violence of the dying apartheid era than on the deaths of colored boys in forgotten townships, the case was noted and filed and left. Then another boy, then another. The pattern did not become visible to the authorities immediately. It became visible to the community first. And it became visible with the particular sharpness of knowledge that comes when you already know the system will not respond adequately. Mothers in Mitchell's Plain and Elsie's River and Ravens Mead and Belleville South stopped letting their boys walk to school alone. They built informal networks of warning. This child did not come home. That child was last seen near the station at Perot. A boy was found in the morning by the tracks in Langa. The information moved through the community the way urgent knowledge always moves through communities that have learned they cannot fully trust official channels. Quietly. Between women at the shops and men at the gates, and teachers who started counting their students more carefully at the end of the school day. The police were slower to name what they were looking at. By the early 1990s, with the body count climbing past 10 and then past 15, the South African Police Service, itself in the turbulent process of transitioning from the apartheid-era force into a post-apartheid institution, a transition that was incomplete and deeply uneven, assembled a task team to investigate what was now being described publicly as a serial murder case. The name came from the geography of the crime scenes, the Station Strangler. A name that gave the killer a mythology, a terrible coherence before anyone understood who he was or what was driving him or why he had been given so many years in which to act. The task team worked the communities. They interviewed witnesses. They looked for patterns in the victim selection, in the locations, in the timing. And in November 1994, 8 years after the first murder, they made an arrest. Norman Afzal Simons, 30 years old, a primary school teacher at a school in the Cape Flats, unmarried, living in Mitchell's Plain. A man who had been part of this community his entire adult life. Known in his neighborhood, known in his school. A man who had, by every outward measure, chosen to dedicate his professional life to the children of the very communities the Station Strangler had been hunting through for 8 years. He was arrested on a November morning in 1994. His first words to the investigators were recorded. He said, "I did not do this. Before we go further, if you are still with me, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. I always find it interesting to know where these stories are reaching. Take a breath. We are about to go somewhere darker." The case against Norman Simons rested on several pillars. A witness who placed him near the scene of one of the murders. Physical evidence that the prosecution argued connected him to the crime. A psychological profile that investigators believed matched his characteristics. And the enormous, crushing weight of context. 22 dead boys, a community in terror, a new democratic government that needed to demonstrate to the nation and to the watching world that justice in post-apartheid South Africa would work differently than it had under the old regime. The trial focused on one murder, not 22, one. The victim was a boy named Elroy Van Rooyen, 12 years old, from Mitchell's Plain. He had disappeared in August 1994. His body was found strangled. Norman Simons was charged specifically with his murder. This was the case the prosecution believed they could prove beyond reasonable doubt. The other 21 deaths were attributed to Simons in the public narrative, in the media coverage, in the understanding of everyone who followed the case. But legally, in court, on the record that would determine a man's fate, only one child's death was prosecuted. Simons pleaded not guilty. His defense team challenged every pillar of the prosecution's case. They challenged the witness testimony on grounds of consistency. The witness's account had changed in certain details between the initial statement and the trial testimony, and those changes were not adequately explained. They challenged the physical evidence on grounds of methodology, how it was collected, how it was handled, whether the chain of custody had been maintained in a way that would satisfy proper forensic standards. They challenged the psychological profile on the grounds that it was not scientific evidence at all, but inference, a picture of a type of person, not a fingerprint that could be linked to a specific individual. Most significantly, the defense argued something that cut to the heart of the entire investigation. They argued that the task team, under extraordinary pressure to close a case that had run for 8 years and claimed 22 lives, had identified their suspect and then built the evidence around him rather than following the evidence to wherever it led. That is a specific and serious allegation. It is the allegation that the investigation ran backwards, that the detectives decided who did it and then went looking for reasons to justify that decision rather than testing it. It is an allegation that, if true, means that the conviction is not justice, but its shadow. The prosecution did not accept any of it. Their position was clear. The witness had seen Simons. The physical evidence was consistent with his involvement. The profile fit him, and the 25 years of silence from whatever other suspects the defense might imagine had produced nothing. Norman Simons was the station strangler. The evidence said so. The witness said so. The profile said so. In 1995, the court agreed. Norman Afzal Simons was convicted of the murder of Elroy Van Rooyen and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was not charged with the other 21 murders. The police closed those files under the assumption that the killer was now behind bars. The station strangler case was officially resolved. But resolution and truth are not always the same thing. In the months and years following Simons's conviction, something began to emerge that would not be easy to explain away. Cases appeared in the Cape Flats: boys, strangulation, locations near railway infrastructure, communities consistent with the station strangler's established pattern of victim selection that did not fit the neat timeline of a single perpetrator now safely imprisoned. Criminologists who had studied the original case and journalists who had reported on it began documenting these new cases and asking the question that the official position was not built to accommodate. If Norman Simons was the station strangler, why were there cases that looked like the station strangler still happening after Simons was behind bars? The authorities' answer was that these were coincidences, unrelated crimes, surface similarities that created a false pattern. The station strangler case was closed. Not everyone found that answer satisfying. Dr. Mickey Pistorius was South Africa's most prominent criminal profiler in this era, a forensic psychologist who had worked on multiple significant serial murder cases, who had built her methodology through the specific and painstaking work of studying how killers operate across multiple crimes rather than one. She had analyzed the station strangler case in detail. She had developed a profile of the perpetrator based on the evidence of all the crime scenes taken together, the victim selection pattern, the method, the geography, the timing. And her conclusion was not one that the official position welcomed. She did not believe the profile she had built matched Norman Simons. She said so, carefully, professionally, with the full weight of her expertise behind it. The statement was recorded and disputed, and the investigation did not reopen. But the doubt had a name now. And doubt, once it has a name, is very difficult to close inside a file. Here is what the conviction did not answer. Norman Simons was convicted of one murder. 1. In a case involving 22 victims, the investigators attributed all 22 deaths to a single perpetrator, the station strangler, and Norman Simons was identified as that perpetrator. But the evidentiary standard that a court of law requires, the standard that must be met before the state can take 25 years from a man's life, was only applied to one of those 22 deaths, which means that legally, officially, and permanently on the record, 21 boys from the Cape Flats were murdered, and not a single person has ever been convicted of any of those murders. 21 families, 21 boys. No answer. Not a contested answer. Not a disputed answer. No answer at all. To understand why the Norman Simons conviction has remained contested for 30 years, you have to understand the specific political moment in which it was made. In April 1994, South Africa held its first fully democratic general election. Nelson Mandela became president. The African National Congress formed a government of national unity. The apartheid state, its laws, its classified racial categories, its structures of legal oppression, was officially dismantled. And the South African Police Service, which had spent 40 years functioning as an instrument of racial suppression, was expected to transform into a professional, accountable, rights-respecting institution that would serve all South Africans equally, including the communities it had spent 4 decades treating as enemies. That transformation was not instant. It could not be. The men who had been police officers under apartheid were still police officers in 1994. The investigative methods, the institutional culture, the assumptions about which communities mattered and which communities could be managed rather than protected, none of that evaporated with a democratic election. The new South Africa needed its police service to prove that it could do what the old South Africa had refused to do. The station strangler case was 8 years old. 22 boys were dead. The Cape Flats was watching. The new government was watching. The international press was watching. Norman Simons was arrested 4 months after the election, convicted less than a year after that. This is not, by itself, evidence of wrongdoing. Investigations do sometimes move quickly when the right evidence crystallizes. Convictions do sometimes follow quickly when the case is genuinely clear. But the timing created a context that the defense articulated directly at trial and that independent observers returned to repeatedly in the years that followed. There was institutional pressure, political pressure, community pressure, international pressure to close this case. And there was pressure to close it in a way that the new South Africa could point to as evidence that justice under the new order was real and swift and different from what had come before. The question that has never been fully laid to rest is whether the justice that was done in 1995 was the right justice, or whether it was the available justice, the justice that the system, under pressure and in transition, was capable of producing, rather than the justice that the 22 boys and their families actually deserved. Legal scholars who reviewed the case in subsequent decades pointed to specific procedural concerns. The eyewitness testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. A witness who placed Simons near the scene of Elroy Van Rooyen's disappearance on the relevant day. That testimony was not corroborated by independent physical evidence that placed Simons specifically at the scene. The psychological profile, while compelling to investigators and to the public narrative of the case, was opinion evidence. It described a category of person, not a specific individual, and it could not be cross-examined the way a fingerprint or a DNA match could be cross-examined. What troubled some reviewers most was the absence of what should have been present. In a case that had run for 8 years and claimed 22 victims, the forensic material available should have been substantial. The investigative work across multiple crime scenes, conducted over nearly a decade, should have produced a significant body of evidence. What was presented at trial, and what was sufficient to convict Norman Simons of one murder, was considerably narrower than what the scope of the investigation might have suggested. Simons went to prison in 1995. He filed appeals. He sought reviews. He maintained his position in every available forum. The conviction was wrong. The evidence was insufficient. The investigation had been shaped by pressure rather than by truth. The years passed. The Cape Flats changed and did not change. The political transition continued. The new South Africa built new institutions and struggled with old inequalities that had not dissolved because the law said they should. The communities of Mitchell's Plain and Elsie's River and Ravensmead remained communities shaped by the history of forced removal and sustained neglect. That kind of damage does not repair itself in a generation. And in those communities, the question of the station strangler did not close the way the official record said it should. Because the mothers still remembered what it had felt like when the boys were disappearing. And some of them were not certain that what they were seeing in the years after Simons went to prison felt like an ending. There is a particular kind of grief that communities carry when justice is ambiguous. It is different from the grief of knowing. When the truth is clear, when there is a trial and a conviction and a name attached to a crime, the grief is devastating, but it has a shape. It has an ending, even if the ending is terrible. But when the truth is contested, when the official answer and the community's lived experience do not align, the grief has no shape. It sits in the body of a community as a permanent unsettled weight. A question that nobody with the authority to answer it is asking anymore. The Cape Flats communities carried that weight. Through the transition to the new South Africa, through the building of new institutions, through the years of Simons's imprisonment and through his release. They carried it because the questions did not go anywhere when the cell door closed. They went underground. The way difficult truths always go underground in communities that have learned the surface is not safe for them. What those communities never received was a full public accounting, not a formal review of the investigative methods that produced the conviction, not an independent examination of the post-conviction cases that some researchers believe bear the station strangler's characteristics. Not a truth process focused on the specific and documented failure to protect those boys for 6 years. The case closed. The file stayed closed. And the communities were left to carry what the official record refused to hold. Here is the detail that the official narrative has never satisfactorily addressed. The psychological profile developed by the investigation described a perpetrator who targeted boys he had access to through trust, a figure of authority or familiarity, someone children would approach willingly, someone embedded in the community in a specific way. Norman Simons was a primary school teacher in that community. The profile fit him, but it did not fit only him. The Cape Flats in the late 1980s and early 1990s was a set of densely populated communities full of men who fit that general description. Teachers, youth workers, church officials, sports coaches, community leaders, men who had daily legitimate access to boys and whom boys trusted on site. The profile described a category, not an individual. And a category that encompasses hundreds or thousands of men in a community of hundreds of thousands of people is not a map that leads to a single door. What the profile did was give investigators a direction. And once they were moving in that direction, toward Norman Simons specifically, the question that the defense raised at trial, and that has never been answered to everyone's satisfaction, is whether the task team, once they had found their direction, ever seriously looked anywhere else. Norman Afzal Simons served his full 25-year sentence. He was released from Pollsmoor Prison in 2019 at the age of 54. He had been in prison since he was 30 years old. He had entered as a primary school teacher and left as an old man who had spent more than half of his adult life inside a cell for a crime he said he did not commit. He has maintained his innocence through every available mechanism: appeals, legal reviews, public statements, interviews with journalists who have revisited the case in the years since his conviction. His account has not changed in its essentials across 30 years. He did not kill Elroy Van Rooyen. He did not kill the other 21 boys attributed to the station strangler. He was convicted on insufficient evidence by a system that needed a conviction more than it needed the truth. That position is not proof of innocence. It needs to be said clearly. Men convicted of crimes they genuinely committed maintain their innocence every day in prisons across the world. The persistence of a claim is not evidence of its accuracy. The sincerity with which a man protests his conviction does not constitute grounds for overturning it. But there is something else that also needs to be said clearly. The absence of proof of innocence is not the same thing as proof of guilt, and the standard required to take 25 years from a person's life, beyond reasonable doubt, is a standard that exists precisely because the state has overwhelming power over the individual, and the consequences of the state being wrong are catastrophic and irreversible. The South African courts reviewed Norman Simons's case through the mechanisms available within the system. The conviction was not overturned. The state's position remains that the evidence against Simons was sufficient and that the conviction was sound. There are people who accept that position. There are people who do not. And between those two groups, the 22 families of the Cape Flats sit in a different and more complicated place than either. For 21 of those families, there was never a conviction to accept or reject. There was simply a boy who went somewhere one morning and did not come home, and a police file that was eventually marked closed, and a name, the station strangler, that was attached to their son's death without anyone ever standing in a court of law and being held accountable for it. For those families, the question of whether Norman Simons is guilty or innocent is almost secondary. Almost. Because what sits behind that question, larger and more permanent, is the question that was never answered at all. Who killed my son? And that question has no answer on the official record. It has an attribution, a filed assumption, but not an answer. What the station strangler case left behind, beyond the grief of 22 families, beyond the disputed conviction of one man, beyond the 30 years of unanswered questions, is a structural document. A record of what happens when a state decides that certain communities are not worth protecting. The Cape Flats murders began in 1986. The investigation that eventually produced an arrest did not move with full urgency until the early 1990s. 6 years during which the community knew, and the police knew, and the state knew. 6 years during which boys kept disappearing, and the response remained inadequate. That is not a resource problem or a procedural failure. It is a policy outcome. The apartheid state had made a calculation, implicit, never formally stated, but visible in every resource allocation and every investigative priority, that the lives of colored boys in the Cape Flats were not worth the full weight of its apparatus. And so the killer, whoever he was, operated in the space that calculation created for 6 years, before the state decided the cost of indifference had become too high. The new South Africa inherited that indifference along with everything else the old state left behind. The transition changed the government and changed the laws, and changed, slowly and unevenly, some of the institutions. But it could not retroactively give those boys their lives back. It could not undo the 6 years of inadequate response. It could not guarantee that the conviction it eventually produced was right. It could only produce a conviction. Whether that conviction was justice is a question that Norman Simons, now in his late 50s and living in the Cape Flats, is still waiting for someone with the authority to answer it to take seriously. 22 boys. That is the number I come back to. Not because it is the largest number in the history of South African crime. Not because it is uniquely shocking in a country that has known extraordinary violence across its history, but because each one of those 22 is a specific child. A specific person who got up on a specific morning and went somewhere and did not come home. A specific mother who waited at a specific door. A specific classroom with a specific empty chair. Norman Simons may be guilty. The court found that he was. The state maintains that he is. He may be innocent. His own account, maintained without variation across 30 years, insists that he is. What is not in dispute, what the official record itself confirms, is that 21 of those boys have no one in prison for what was done to them. 21 murders, no conviction, no name, no accountability of any kind. In communities that the state had decided mattered, in a different political moment with a different institutional response from the beginning, the killer, whoever he was, would have operated in a much smaller window. If the full weight of the investigative apparatus had come down on the first death the way it should have, there might not have been a second. There might not have been 22. The Cape Flats gave him the space to take 22. And the question of who he was, whether Norman Simons was telling the truth when he said it was not him, whether someone else walked those station platforms for 8 years and was never caught, whether the boys of the Cape Flats are still waiting for someone to say their names and mean it. That question is still open. Some vines grow in the dark for a very long time before anyone thinks to look for them. And some of them are still growing. These boys deserved better. Their families deserve better. And the only thing that keeps stories like this one from disappearing entirely is people like you deciding they are worth knowing. If this story stayed with you, and I think it will, share it with one person today. Subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment below. Tell me what you think really happened in the Cape Flats. Tell me whether you believe the right man went to prison. I read every single one. I will see you in the next one.